Very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And I know it's a busy conference agenda, so really thankful to have you all here today. This is a panel on galvanising green growth. How can government and business work together to decarbonise the built environment in a way which prioritises and delivers economic growth? My name is Josh Buckland. I'm a senior fellow at Policy Exchange, and I'll introduce the rest of the panel in a moment. But firstly, just some ground rules. We've got about an hour. We may try and wrap up slightly close to 1 o'clock because Mel has to go a little bit early, and obviously there's a lot going on this afternoon. Please, therefore, keep your questions relatively focused, and please keep them as questions rather than statements. And I will try and give as much time to questions as we can, given we're obviously going to be pressed for time. The other thing I'd say is try and make your questions constructive, but do feel free to challenge our panelists. I'm the chair, so I get to challenge them myself, but you should definitely also be doing the same. So please bear that in mind when we get into the Q&A session. Firstly, just before I do introduce the panel, setting the scene for today's conversation. Government has an ambitious 2030 clean power mission. There's been a lot of talk about the gloom that we've seen more generally in politics over the last couple of weeks, but the one positive ray of light has most definitely been the central fact that the new government has placed the decarbonisation agenda and the clean power mission right at the centre of their programme for the new government, which is exciting. That requires a significant electrification of the UK economy, and not just the building of power stations, but critically the electrification of our homes, our businesses, our commercial properties in a way that hasn't really been seen in terms of fundamental economic change since the industrial era. And it's safe to say that the UK is relatively behind when it comes to that broader electrification journey. The UK has made great strides in the past, but has fallen back. And energy efficiency levels and energy improvement levels have fallen off a cliff under the previous government. And to put it into context, we used to install around 1 million loft insulation measures every year. At the end of the previous government, we were down to around 200,000 a year. And given only 15% of the UK's building stock was built after 1990, there's a real considerable problem with improving the energy performance of our homes and ensuring that we get the low carbon technologies to the businesses that are needed. In addition, we haven't had an active industrial strategy. And actually what we've seen in the commercial and business side is not a shift to low carbon technologies, but a shift to businesses closing in the face of rising energy costs. So the thing which I'm really keen to get into today is not just the decarbonisation mission that we're all on, but how we make the economic value of that a reality in a way which actually improves our economic prospects as a country and supports the government's broader new economic mission. So hopefully we've got the right panel to get into that today. Let me just introduce them briefly before I ask them to make some opening statements. Firstly, we've got Melanie On, who is the Labour MP for Great Grimsby and Cleethorpes, and was also previously the MP up to 2019. She's had a range of shadow ministerial jobs, including as Shadow Deputy Leader of the House of Commons, and is obviously, to all of you in this room will know, a very strong advocate of the green industries, having previously been Deputy CEO of Renewable UK. So we're very pleased to have Mel with us today. I'm also joined by Mark Casey, who is the Managing Director of Projects at the Mighty Group, and thanks to Mighty for sponsoring today's panel. He joined in 2022 and has 25 years of experience working across the decarbonisation and built environment, including obviously the important role that he now takes on. We've also joined by Ryan Jude, who is the Labour Councillor in Westminster and also the Programme Director at the Green Finance Institute. Many will also know that Ryan stood as the prospective parliamentary candidate in Tatton at the recent general election, and despite the kind of people of Tatton maybe not having the best common sense, he did increase the vote share by 14% for Labour and lost by only 1,000 votes in what is traditionally a very safe Conservative seat. So hopefully we'll see you going places next time round, Ryan. And then lastly, Tim Lord, who is the Head of Climate at HSBC. HSBC are doing a lot to help customers decarbonise, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that today. Tim and I actually worked in government together, where he has spent over 20 years on climate and the low carbon space, and has also had stints at the Tony Blair Institute and most recently also at Phoenix Group. So it's great to have Tim with us as well. With that, then, I'm going to go round the panel and ask them just an opening question and then get some opening reflections and thoughts. Critically, we'll then come to questions. So start thinking about your questions. You're thinking about your areas of challenge for the panel as we move through. So firstly, Mel, I'm going to come to you first. the government has, as I said, got a very ambitious 2030 clean power mission. Maybe just give us some thoughts on kind of why 2030 matters, what success look like come the next election, how does this fit into the broader kind of political strategy of the new government, and how do you see kind of clean industries and obviously within that the built environment playing a role?
That's a lot of questions. I didn't even have time to write them down. So you can pick me up on the things I don't answer. I mean, I think 2030 is not just an ambition for the UK. I think that this sits in terms of global leadership, and I really worry that there has been too much sitting on the back seat when it comes to taking actions in which you can then demonstrate that you take issues seriously, like climate change. And that has certainly been the case over the last few years. And so having a clean energy mission is bold and brave, exactly what you need in a brand new government. And what it has also done is given industries in this space who have been waiting for so much time for some clarity to be able to say, great, this is it, we can press go and we're going to do this. I think that it is very bold and it is very brave, and I don't know whether we will get there. Because there are so many different elements to it, and time is running out. And I feel, that there have been so many wasted years and so many wasted opportunities. And what we now see as you get into government, you can't do everything everywhere all at once. You do have to prioritise, and you do have to pick the areas of focus that you want to try and achieve. And I think when it comes to actually dealing with decarbonisation in a built environment, it is one of the best and most visible and straightforward ways for government to be able to start making the huge leaps, because we know that it will also benefit consumers as well if we're going down a decarbonisation route, because it does involve insulation, which means it will have a direct impact on people's bills. And there is also a movement, I'll just say, sorry, because I know you want to do quick ones, there is also a movement of recognising that there is a proportion of society that can do some of this work much more easily than another proportion of society, and that it would be it would be sensible of the government to concentrate on targeting those people who are able, and then get them to be willing to participate in joining in the journey. And I think that there is something as well about framing this, because I think all the stuff around energy it is really, really exciting, but we are going to need a huge amount of infrastructure in the country, and for all of us to start recognising that we have a role to play as kind of 21st century industrialists, bringing back great challenges that the country faces and providing the solutions to them, and being part of that brave journey, because the things that made us proud of being British in the past can make us proud of being British again if we start to build and we start to deliver and we start to recognise that through those great initiatives we will make the country fit for the future, so fit for future generations, but also bring everybody along with us in a really meaningful way that is about setting up a kind of vision of what the country needs, what it will look like, rather than just relying on quite technical engagement, which I think loses the heart of what is necessary to get the public on the journey with us all.
Very good. Yeah, thanks, Mel. And I'm sure we'll pick up some of those themes as we get into the kind of questions, especially around the how do we bring people on that journey in a way that resonates with them at an emotional level rather than just obviously at a technocratic level. I'm then going to come to you, Mark, if that's all right. And obviously the government has talked a lot about clean power and the importance of that agenda. It's actually talked less about the built environment. So you're obviously doing a lot across the business in the built environment, both at residential, commercial and business level. Kind of why does it matter, and why should the new government be focusing on it over its other priorities?
Sure, thanks, Josh. And I guess just before starting, if just to bring to life in terms of what we do as Mighty as a business, we're the leading facilities manager in the UK. We employ approximately 68,000 people and professionals across the UK managing buildings. whether it's cleaning services, security, engineering, project and construction. And the buildings that we look after, whether it be government, local authority, some of the UK's critical national infrastructure such as NATS, Network Rail, Heathrow Airport to bring to life, but also some of the largest corporates across the country. And you say, why? I mean, Josh, in terms of 25% of carbon emissions in the UK comes from the buildings that we manage. And so therefore, whether it's government organisations, whether it's corporates, we've all got sustainability net zero goals. And there's a general recognition in terms of the amount of carbon that comes out of the built environment. It's a big challenge that we're all now looking to solve. I lead a projects team. We do solar, we do EV rollouts, we do battery storage, we do grid connection work, we do LED light fittings. Companies are all looking for, and local authorities are all looking for, sustainable solutions. Why does it matter? It's recognising the level of carbon emissions that you actually see coming out of the built environment, and it's not just that; it's the energy consumption. And many corporates today are looking towards going towards green energy solutions. So getting the energy mix right, making sure the buildings that you're working in are the most efficient, retrofitting buildings, modernising assets to really help the UK on its broader objectives around clean power. There are things that we're going to need to do differently. If we think about some of the, Melanie, the ambition and that we have within the country, and there's probably 3 or 4 areas worth considering. Firstly is we need to speed up grid connections. So I think there's 700 gigawatts of renewable green energy projects that are sat in the queuing system towards getting grid connections. That's something that will benefit us all if we can speed that up. Secondly is around, can we look to incentivise business to invest in modernising buildings, the rollout of EV? Are there tax incentives, VAT, for example, that could be considered? And then lastly, green skills leads to green jobs, which ultimately will lead to sustainable green growth. And thinking about our labour forces and retraining people who work within energy, renewables, properties to actually be able to overcome, the skills that we're going to need for the future. Are just some things to think about, Josh.
Brilliant. No, and I think that number you've kind of used, that a quarter of all our greenhouse gas emissions come from the built environment, just show how serious this is as an issue, but also as an economic opportunity, which I'm sure we'll come back to. I'm going to then come to you, Ryan. Actually, maybe with a little bit more of your local hat on. Obviously, we've talked, and actually Mark talks about the work they're doing with local authorities. Kind of, what is the political opportunity here for local authorities? Kind of, how are local authorities thinking about this? And also, critically, how do we harness their responsibilities and perspectives to ensure they're actually making progress on this at scale? But obviously, feel free to also touch on the national work you're doing on mobilising finance.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Josh. So, as mentioned, I'm Councillor in Westminster. I'm Cabinet Member for Climate, Ecology and Culture. Have been, we won Westminster Council first time in 2022. It had been Tory for its entire history before that. And we placed climate action right at the heart of the work we've been doing. And I'm delighted to say that we are now ranked the top single-tier council in the country on climate action by Climate Emergency UK. But the stark reality is that despite all the ambition and the action that we've been doing, we have funding constraints in local authorities that everyone is familiar with. And even with targeting that as efficiently as we can, none of us are currently going to meet our own net zero target. So in Westminster, that's 2030 net zero target. And there's 2 big reasons for that. Funding aside, one is the grid, and the other one is our built environment. So if I start on the grid, for me to get to 2030 net zero, Westminster City Council's owned assets, I could electrify everything. I could electrify every single building, I could get all EVs, but if that grid is still dirty, I won't meet my targets. And this was a huge frustration for me under the previous government, or their 2035 net zero grid target. So, Mel very honestly has said, we don't know whether we're going to get there on the 2030. Well, I really hope you do. I really hope you do for my local elections, and we really want to work with you guys to make sure that we can meet it. And then built environment's the other big one for us. 25% of UK emissions. In Westminster, the built environment is 86% of our emissions. So it's the thing that keeps me up at night every single day. How can I retrofit our residential properties? How can I work with our commercial properties to make sure that they get to net zero? And if I just touch on some of our experiences, delivery through local authorities is going to be absolutely crucial to meeting all of our climate goals. We know our areas the best. We know some of the blockers that people are experiencing. So an example is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. Obviously, councils bid in for this. We got money that we could then go to our social housing units and retrofit their properties. So we got a couple of million, and we thought, this is fantastic. We're going to go to these people, we're going to say, we're going to, for free, reduce your energy usage and save you hundreds of pounds every single year. And take-up was so low. There was mistrust of the council, there was mistrust of the contractors who came, there was a misunderstanding. What do you mean I need to move out for 4 to 5 weeks? Are you tricking me to make me move out permanently? What do you mean that I'm going to have to lose a little bit of internal space in my building because there is a listed outside wall? That doesn't mean anything to a lot of them. These are really real constraints that we come up against every single day. So we then put extra money into our engagement team. Councillors gone out there and happily we've retrofitted 700 homes from the SHDF over the last couple of years. We're one of the most successful councils in doing it. But if that money doesn't come via us and with our experience and our knowledge of the local area, then you don't get that progress made. And this then links to some of the work that we do at GFI. So I lead the Built Environment Programme at the Green Finance Institute. We're a non-profit set up by the government and the city to work on greening the financial system, greening the economy. And we've done a lot of work to improve the amount of green mortgages on offer, to work with the banks so that they can improve their green offer. But we've been saying for years that unless government has long-term certainty and clarity on their policies, and alongside that, a big awareness-raising campaign for consumers, we're never going to get to where we need to get to. The banks could offer as many green mortgages as they want to. If a consumer doesn't understand why they should take that out, then they're not going to take it out. And why would a bank offer it if they can't see where the demand's going to come from? So again, Mel touched on this. Clarity and certainty is absolutely central to getting this done. So we're doing some work on that. We're doing a lot of work in the local council, and I'm sure we're going to go into a lot more detail during the panel.
Right. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, really interesting perspective and some kind of stark numbers, especially on the impact that has on a local authority area. Just so everyone's aware, I'm going to try and come to questions straight after I've then introduced our last panelist, so start thinking now, otherwise I get to ask the questions, which is less exciting. So Tim, I was going to come to you just as our last contributor. You're the man with the money at the end, and the guy who we've all talked about the need for more cash from to mobilise investment in this space. Kind of what's currently holding things back? What's the role of the private sector here? And also critically, how do you work with both national and local politicians to make that a reality?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Josh. I mean, I think the first thing to say is this is so important, right? We have been too slow in taking action on building emissions. We've heard some of the numbers around the proportion of emissions that come from buildings, but even more importantly, when we think about the 2030 net zero power target and the other kind of strategic goals the government's put in place, buildings are the big swing factor, right? They are absolutely critical to how you run your future energy system. And the other key thing is, of course, when I think about our retail customers, this is the bit that is most visible of the whole net zero transition to people. And this is the bit, if we get it right and it works for consumers, it makes the whole transition so much more straightforward. In terms of the role of the private sector, the first thing I'd say is this is not just about government policy, right? There is a temptation to say, this is all, government policy has held us back, government funding's held us back. But actually there's a lot that we need to do, right, in terms of investing in our products, in our propositions, in our capability, thinking about our risk appetites, what we lend for, who we lend to, all those kind of things. So I think, the first thing is there is a big responsibility on the big corporates to do that. Now, having said that, you do need better government policy and more consistent government policy, and businesses always say that on panels like this. But the example I would give is if I'm thinking about, you mentioned green mortgages. If I'm thinking about a mortgage proposition for our customers, if I'm thinking about something for our business customers, that is a long process to develop that. We have to go through regulatory approvals. We have to make the decisions around allocating capital within the business to support that. And if we have, as we have had to some degree over recent years, a lot of chopping and changing to funding arrangements and so on, that is a big disincentive for businesses like us who can facilitate the transition to invest. So the more consistency that we have in terms of funding, etc., the more you will see businesses innovating around that, bringing new products and propositions, hopefully making it easier for their customers. The second thing is economic incentives really, really matter here. At the moment, in some cases, decarbonising makes business sense on a relatively short time scale. In some cases, at the moment, it doesn't. Some of that is because we need to get the transition moving and costs will come down. Some of it is more structural things around, the way we structure energy bills and various other things in the UK. And I think getting, the biggest problem we have actually is demand. Do people want to do this stuff? Are they keen to do it? Are they coming to us for finance to do it? And so the more we can get the economic incentives right, whether that's households, whether that's medium-sized, large corporates, that has to be absolutely critical to getting the transition moving. And then the last thing is, we know that this is a transition. You can kind of pick your number depending on which report you use, but somewhere between 250 and 500 billion of capex to deliver this transition. That is not going to be publicly funded. I don't think it should be publicly funded. I think the private sector and private finance can provide a lot of that. But there are some bits of it that are risky. There are some bits of it that are, at earlier innovation stages. There are some bits of it that are less widely deployed in the UK. So I think government thinking really strategically through GB Energy, through the National Wealth Fund, about where it can best leverage us in by helping to de-risk some of those more innovative schemes, some of the ones that perhaps we've done less of in the past. I think you can have a huge multiplier effect and really get the finance flowing.
Great. Thanks, Tim. And yeah, similar themes actually around kind of customer trust, the role of the state versus the private sector. So some good consistency as well in terms of the remarks. I'm going to throw it open to questions now. Please stick your hand up and I'll come to you in a decent order. And then obviously do feel free to direct at an individual panellist, but I hold the mic and therefore can direct them at others as well. Gentleman in the back, start us off.
Thank you very much. Tom Lowe from Thermal Storage UK. How would you speed up the electrification of heat in domestic settings? Question to all the panellists.
You want to go first? Tim, why don't you, given you looked at this from a government perspective, as well as also from a business perspective, give us some initial thoughts.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is, historically, we've had a kind of fabric-first approach, right? If you think back to 2010, the broad strategy when the coalition government came in was, we'll sort out energy efficiency in this decade, and then we'll worry about heat a bit later. No, we're now in 2024. We've got 25 million homes to decarbonise and 25 years to do it. So clearly we need to be thinking about building fabric alongside heating is the first thing. I think secondly, we need a bit more clarity around technology pathways and how we're going to decarbonise heating, which I think there's still quite a lot of ambiguity about, and how we're going to do that, not just nationally, but in local and regional areas, given different solutions will work in different parts of the country. I think the third thing for me is, how do you get this market moving? It's not about how do you solve for the hardest to treat home, which is going to be really, really challenging because it's in a conservation area or whatever it might be. It's about how do you kind of get us on the kind of vertical bit of the S-curve, which is the bit that we need to move to. And for me, the key thing is, first of all, as I say, getting the economics right for householders and for an increasing proportion of householders. But secondly, it's about the kind of clarity and ease of the customer journey. At the moment, what do I need to do in my house? That's really hard to figure out. Who am I going to get to do it? And some of us, including me, have tried to do this. It's really hard to figure out who's going to do it. Where am I going to get the money from? That's pretty tough to figure out. What's it going to cost me and when's it going to pay back? That, again, is really difficult to figure out. And at each part of that customer journey, even if you're willing at the start, you're going to have big attrition as you go through each of those. But all of those problems, I think, are solvable. And part of that, as I say, is on us to make sure we've got the right partnerships in place when you're coming to us for finance to make that easy. But I think part of it is about having the right policy, the right consistent funding, whether it's for householders or for businesses in place, that provides that incentive for people to kind of enter that customer journey. Any other thoughts?
Well, the technology direction is absolutely critical, because I just think, having spoken to housing association providers and what they're looking at in terms of future-proofing their housing stock, how they're going to build their next generation of housing stock. There is such a lack of clarity around technology, and it's a really weird thing because obviously previous government has not said we're going down this route. It's all going to be, air source heat pumps. That's definitely what we're doing, or we're all going to have hydrogen cells in our house, and that's how we're going to have our kind of immediate turn on, turn off fuel. Is that, I suppose there's a little bit of a question, is that the role for government? Does government need to set that level of granular direction? Because I think there is a point, some of it will work better in other areas around the country. Not everybody lives in a highly built up area like Westminster. That there are different solutions that are required. But it's really, really intrinsic, because if we cannot get some level of consistency and clear direction around the kind of technologies that people will be having in their homes, or the kind of things that are needed on a kind of industrial commercial level as well. It is just going to be too scattergun, and everybody's going to be fighting for a bit of the pie, and it just won't go far enough, and we won't be able to deliver. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's a very, very urgent question that needs to be answered. And I would just say there are quite a lot of different groups around government in the Labour Party that are thinking about this stuff, because I think it's right, it hasn't been talked about in as greater detail as other areas around all of the green growth topics.
So I just want to build on some of that. You're going to hear clarity and consistency said an awful lot today. I led the Zero Carbon Heating Task Force out of GFI, working with government 4 years ago now, which is crazy to think about, because in that, we made some great policy recommendations that didn't happen. I'm hoping they now will start to happen. So if I just touch on some of those, zoning is going to be crucial to decarbonising our heat, because it starts to give some clarity. So zoning is where we're going to designate different parts of the country to say your best path to decarbonising heat is a heat network. I'm hoping that the flip side will therefore be, if you aren't in a heat network zone, then you should probably get a heat pump. So then at least there's clarity. And what that means is that if we have, and a lot of Westminster will be designated as heat network zones, then investors can go, all right, that has been told it's going to be a heat network zone. There's going to be connections built there, and maybe we mandate public sector buildings to join. So there's a base level of demand to justify my investment, and then we can give the residential around it the optionality of joining. So then we've got clarity, consistency through technology, and then there's still a choice for the consumer. I think that's really important. A couple of other things. Anyone who works in the built environment knows that EPCs are fundamentally broken. And, we did an eco show home in Westminster where it got to an EPC B. And I remember saying to the team, what do you mean we're doing a show home that isn't an EPC A? And they said, well, when we put the heat pump in, it brought it back down. And that is just ridiculous. As we all know, so much of it is based on the cost to heat the home. And so there's rebalancing of levies that we need to do, but also EPCs need reform so that they are promoting the right sort of intervention as well. And also on support, Westminster, very built up area, again, a lot of it's going to be heat networks. When I ran in Tatton, so many homes there are off the gas grid. You still had areas that were using oil boilers. They need a lot more support to be able to get heat pumps into their homes, and that's where government grants and government money can really be impactful. Back to Westminster, those heat networks, give the zoning, give the clarity, and the investors will come. They've done it in the Nordics, they've done it in the Baltics. We've just dragged our feet for too long here, and I'm really looking forward to this government moving a lot quicker on getting these things done.
I think I echo the point you're saying there, Ryan, about the zoning, the planning, and defining those. For example, from a heat network standpoint, what we're also seeing more broadly in the commercial sector is a lot more demand coming in when replacing heating systems, coming for air source or gas source or ground source heat pumps. And we are seeing a lot more demand starting to come through. But certainly the point you were making there, Ryan, in terms of zoning and planning and identifying areas where heat networks could, prosper is definitely a good thing to do.
No, thanks. And I'd also just pick up something Ryan said about the kind of policy cost rebalancing you kind of mentioned very briefly. I'd recommend people look up the spark spread and the differential between the spark spread in the UK versus the other countries, and that is the difference between electricity and gas prices. One of the reasons that it's so difficult to get heat pumps deployed here is because gas heating is so much cheaper than electric, and it's kind of 4 times higher to heat home with electric, which is a problem that we kind of, unless we resolve that, it's very different to see how the technology clarity comes through.
I said it so quickly and flippantly because we have spent years talking about this, and I know that Melanie and the MPs now do understand it's an issue.
Good. Other questions? Hands up. Gentleman in the back, and then the lady over there. I'll come to both of you. That's all right. Wrap them together.
I think you've pretty much been almost getting to the point I wanted to ask about, which is the question of tax on fuel of various different types, and in particular the different rates that people, the lower rate that people pay domestically on gas as a source, and there's also a which is ridiculous really. You should pay a lower rate on electricity, or you should probably pay the standard rate on everything. But Labour doesn't want to talk about tax. And the other thing is a very strange thing. I'm actually the treasurer of a small village hall. In the winter months, it's heated electric. It has electric heating, and in the winter months we tip over. We go over a certain threshold, and I can't remember the exact number. We suddenly get into the climate change levy on our electric bill, and also we then go into the 20% VAT rate as well. So we just tip over one extra unit, and we're suddenly paying about £100 a month extra, which is, again, a completely misdesigned financial incentives.
Yeah, no, well, a very good point. I'd be keen to talk to the panel about that. Just the lady by the door, and then I'll come back to the panel if that's all right.
Hello, Rachel Morrison from Bloomberg. What difference do you think it would make if Ed Miliband were, say, to reinstate 2030 as a deadline for private landlords to achieve EPC ratings of C or above?
Good question. Excellent. Okay, so two questions there. One on kind of the overall tax kind of regime around energy and how that's disadvantaging both businesses to make the transition as well as households. And then on just the kind of role of potentially setting a more stringent target for decarbonising by 2030 the built environment and whether that will have an impact. Who wants to come in first? Ryan?
Yeah, happy to. I didn't get elected, as has been alluded to, so I can be more free in my views on this. The EPCC reinstating that, obviously that'll be a positive thing. You know, there's a reason that we all thought it was a positive thing in the first place. It gave us something to work towards, and it gave a stick that was far enough out that incentives today, carrots today, to help them would enable them to get to there. And look, you know, fuel poverty, we all know, it's worse in the PRS than any other sector. So it's also a social justice question, ensuring that we push the EPCs up on landlords. I will say, though, that even with the MEIS, that there have been many efficiency standards regulation, there were issues with it that would need fixing. So again, in Westminster, there was an exemption cap on the amount that you had to spend. I can't remember, I think it was 10 grand. And you can imagine the property prices in Westminster, the work she needed to do, most landlords ended up being exempt. So we started setting up our own local grant facility that landlords could bid into. We're going to need more support for these areas where the costs are too high, and then the people who end up suffering are the tenants, who often end up being in fuel poverty. So we do think it should be reinstated the same way that the U-turn on EV phase out that the previous government did has already been reversed. Quickly on taxes on various different types of heat. Again, Josh just touched on this. The incentives are completely wrong. We all know that. And what we need to do is therefore take some of those taxes off electricity that were there for historical reasons, for good reasons. The question is, where do you put them? A few years ago, the answer was always put them onto gas. When we're in a cost of living crisis with energy bills where they are, I'm not sure you can do that. We think it should go into general taxation. And then, of course, that opens up a whole other discussion as to where you raise that tax from, which is out of my remit.
Very good. Mark?
So just a couple of points. I think our view as well is that rebalancing levies from electricity onto fossil fuels would be a positive thing. It would stimulate, again, modernisation of buildings and of the built environment. In commercial property, I think EPC B rating for all commercial properties by 2030. Again, a positive thing, embraced by investors, embraced by landlords. What it's also doing, again, is that stimulation of owners of buildings to actually, again, modernise and upgrade their estate, which is a positive thing. And also, if you think about the green jobs, the green skills, the opportunity it provides in terms of upgrading and modernising the built environment is a positive thing. But the rebalancing definitely of levies from electricity to other fuel sources, again, would be a net positive.
Very good. Tim, do you want to come in, or I'm going to move on?
Sure. Just quickly, I think on the rebalancing point, I mean, it kind of goes back to that point about clarity of strategy, that if you are clear on what your strategy is for, in particular decarbonising heating, then a number of consequences flow from that, and a number of economic and other barriers arise, and one of them is that. But I think until you've got that clarity of where you're trying to get to, I think it's quite a hard argument to win. But if you do have
on that, Tim, do you mean kind of clarity on whether hydrogen for heat is going to be
on technology pathways, essentially, right? And if it's electrification and you have, as you say, very different ratio between electricity and gas prices to other countries, then clearly that becomes a problem that you need to look at how you can tackle. What I would say is, it has to be done in a fair way, right? And one of the challenges here is clearly, some people are less able to move off gas, for example, and don't have the capital to enable them to do that. If we're then loading more costs onto those people and those households, that's something we need to think very carefully about how to manage. I think on the point on private landlords and EPCs, etc., whether 2030 is the right day or as Ryan said, there were some challenges with that policy. But I think the key thing is it has to be consistent, because essentially if policy changes in the way that we saw last time, it provides an active disincentive to people who kind of want to do the right thing to do it, because there's wasted time and effort for those who are planning to move quickly, and the incentive is of course to wait and see if it changes. And so I think whatever we end up with, it has to be clear, it has to be consistent, and it has to be stuck with and followed through, because that's otherwise going to be a real brake on investment.
No, and I like the point that Mark made about the fact that that regulatory system does broadly already exist in the business community, so there's some consistency between kind of households and business, which is something we should think through. Other questions from the floor? Lady at the back, and then I'll come to Jill as well.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kate Gill-Martin. I'm Chief Exec at the British Hydropower Association, but I'm also a non-exec at a local community benefit society, and we're doing the Net Zero Terrace Streets project in Rosendale, which is in East Lancashire. So we're on the ground and we're doing it, and it's obviously really difficult. But going to your point, Mel, it's actually we've got a clarified solution, because a lot of terrace houses are too small to have an air source heat pump. So we've ruled out the fact that they're not going to be on district heat networks because there's not enough heat load. So we're looking at shared ground loop. And the key with shared ground loop is it's infrastructure, and you can put debt on infrastructure, and you can wrap that debt with the retrofit debt and also the smart system, because smart system is key to make these houses flex ready, so we can return the benefits of flexibility to the consumer aggregated across the substation. And that's a key point, because the future benefits of flexibility otherwise are going to get extracted from the system. One of the big problems we've got is obviously that DESNZ is very siloed. So you have your Flex Unlocked, you have your Green Home Finance Accelerator, you have your energy efficiency, you have your fuel poverty. And we ran a DESNZ workshop recently and said, look, we're doing all these things. Can you have a department that actually touches on all these things as well? So we've said to them, can you set up a bit like the Heat Network Delivery Unit? Can you have a community decarbonisation unit? So you're not siloed. So when funding streams come out, we're not pitted against lots of other, we can pit for one particular project.
I'm going to have to just guide you towards final question.
We're working, this is the question for Tim really. We're working with UKIB. The big problem here is that they've got 4 billion to go through local authorities for projects such as this, and they're really keen that our local authority puts that money in. The local authority looks at them in horror because they have not got the resources to take any money from UKIB. So that's my first point. How do we make that better? And also we're looking at a non-grant dependent model, but that will take iterations of grant funding. So how can HSBC or people who want to invest in the infrastructure get us to that point by talking to government and saying, well, we'll invest at this point. Sorry, long-winded, sorry.
Great. Excellent. So yeah, just a question on the kind of how we make best use of technology and deal with silos and departments, and then also just something on the kind of how we best use the private sector to mobilise funding at local authority level. So Tim, why don't I come to you on the latter, and then maybe come back to you, Mel, on the first?
Yeah, so it sounds like a great project, and as you say, a great example of the fact that this isn't a kind of transition that happens in swim lanes, and when it's happening on the ground, it brings a lot of different things together. I mean, I think the key thing in terms of finance is, first of all, where it's UKIB or the National Wealth Fund, if they've got a clear strategic priority around the built environment, where are they using that to leverage in a wide range of finance providers into projects at scale, which may be, I don't know, forgive me, the scale of your project, but it may be about how you can bring those together across local authority areas or multiple local authority areas. Because I guess for us, one of the challenges we see, not just in this space, but more broadly in the transition, is the kind of transaction cost is very high. It's lots of individual projects which require a huge amount of work on all sides to kind of make them financeable and to get the money flowing. The more we can get UKIB or the Wealth Fund playing that kind of convening role to bring multiple banks together, trying to get into the tens, hundreds of millions, billions, rather than at the smaller scale, I think the more the financiers will be able to come behind it. And as I said at the start, partly that's about us, right, and making sure that we're thinking about how we fund projects like that, which are a bit different to what we're used to. But I think more broadly, it's about having the right funding institutional landscape to enable us to come in.
Right, thanks. Ryan, you just wanted to comment on that before I go to Mel?
Yeah, just really quickly, it's worth saying that at GFI, we ran the National Wealth Fund Task Force that has put the recommendations out to Treasury, and as part of that, we have said that they probably want alongside it an advisory or a governance function that helps with that convening between local authorities and UKIB and the National Wealth Fund. I see this from both sides as a cabinet member in the council and speaking to councils every single day. And you're absolutely right. They don't have the resources to engage, but a government set up institution with an arm dedicated to bridging that gap would be really powerful. And our recommendations are with Treasury, and we look forward to seeing what they do with them.
Excellent. So do I. Mel, on the point around kind of government coming together in a more cohesive way.
Oh, it's like a perennial issue, isn't it? If it's not internal within a department, it's between the departments trying to get something. I mean, I think that where we have seen a step change with everything that the Labour Party set up around the kind of mission-led governance, having the mission boards in place, all of the different structures that have been decided upon are intended to try and break down some of those silos internally and try and look at things much more globally so that you are able to keep pushing things along. I mean, I think it's a bit of a project management strategy. I think is the best way to describe it, because you can't achieve anything unless all parts are pulling in the right direction. And I think it is just really trying to. And it's very, very difficult. I didn't realise, and I came back into Parliament, and like some of my friends now are ministers. It's very exciting. I was like, oh God, all my cohort, they're running the country. But they were saying that even within government departments, they're not on the same email system. I just find it absolutely ridiculous. Seeing people carrying like 4 different mobile phones around because it's all so fragmented. So there is lots of institutional stuff to still overcome. But I do think that the different setups within departments, particularly in DESNES, have been designed specifically to try and bring people together, break down those silos. Some of that will be cultural as well, I think, which is is a bigger challenge. And probably will come from the leadership side of things more than anything else.
Yeah, no, and I think some of it, having been in government, kind of sometimes it takes time to bed in as well, which obviously is a test over the long term. I'm just going to do a final round of questions. Jill, I know you wanted to come in, and then Georgia at the back as well. So let's do both of those and then wrap up.
Thanks, Josh. My question might overlap slightly with where we've been before. Just wanted to ask the panel how they thought GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund would most add value, what they needed to do, and how to ensure that the sort of imminence of GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund doesn't sort of deter people and delay investments because people think something is coming along that might change the investment environment in the short term. So,
very good. And then George at the back.
Hello, Georgia Berrier, Director of Praseg. My question is about future building, and I know we have slightly touched on this, but of course we've got some pretty punchy housing targets that are going to be delivered upon at pace. I'm just interested in the question around the recent UK Green Building Council's net zero carbon standard that is about to be launched, and whether those sort of standards are being incorporated into our housing targets, because as we know, when national planning is altered, it's a relatively rare time. That happens sort of only several years, so there is a great window of opportunity to incorporate those standards into planning right now.
Thanks. Just before you head off, Mel,
yeah,
GB Energy, what's it about?
I'm quite excited by GB Energy. I know, it's creeping up. So I just think it's a really, really good point. But I don't think that it's something to be concerned about in terms of putting people off investing. And all of the conversations that I've had with business is that just setting the sense of direction and remembering that GB Energy will be utilised for de-risking big projects. It's not going to be, paying for everything. And that needs to sit alongside the industrial strategy side of things as well. I think you can't do one without the other, because you need to have a very clear idea of what government really wants to see. The choice picks, I suppose, of industrial value and industrial benefit in terms of jobs and GVA. So I don't think it will put companies off. I think that it will. I've got a lot of faith in Jürgen Meyer. I think an inspired appointment for Jürgen to be doing that. It needs to happen quickly, though, and I do think when you're setting anything new up, it can take quite a long time. And I think, if it's not done in a year, it's going to be really, really difficult. But at least the intent is there, and the planning. And I, wonder whether there will be something that is also slightly retrospective by the time it's set up, because we will broadly know what it is that government is interested in doing. I mean, I think I could probably tell you, but anyway, I won't.
Next time.
Just in case I'm wrong, and I
Episode
don't want to
two.
embarrass myself.
Mark, maybe I'll just bring you in, thanks Mel, just on the kind of new build side as well, kind of the importance of ensuring that the kind of a rush to try and build more houses doesn't necessarily undermine the idea around kind of greening our homes and leading to decarbonisation.
I think probably a couple of things on that. One is definitely, and again, I'll come at it more from a commercial property angle and then touch a little bit on residential. Whether it's BREEAM standards, WELL standards, whether it's whether it's net zero properties, there's definitely investment going into to ensure renewable energy. The circular economy principles in terms of when you're fitting out buildings is all coming through in terms of design of offices and design of buildings into the future. And so less so on the residential side, I'll probably pass that over to Ryan. But definitely the whole principles around net zero standards, sustainable buildings, it's important to attract tenants. It's also important to attract the employees of the companies that you work with, because they want to work in sustainable environments. But I'll hand over, maybe, Ryan, do you want to touch on the residential side?
Yeah, firstly, I really agree with what you just said about commercial and people wanting to be in these net zero spaces. People want to feel like they're a responsible business with a responsible landlord. And in Westminster, we set up something called the Sustainable City Charter, which was developed alongside local developers and local property owners for them to voluntarily say, we're going to decrease our emissions going forward. And they've been really good on that, actually. And so there is a want from the developer world. Residential, yes, we need to be building net zero homes. The 2016 scrapping of the zero home standard has added £22 billion cumulatively onto residential bills since then. The impact that meant, the impacts of the recent energy crisis was so much higher because of it. And, most of the buildings that we're going to have in 2050 have already been built. And so it's so frustrating that now what could have cost £5,000 between 2016 and 2024 to make a building net zero is now going to cost 25, 30 grand in retrofit costs, sometimes much, much more than that. So yes, I agree with you. National Wealth Fund, GB Energy, quickly to Jill's question. I don't think it should delay projects, because projects that can happen without it should be happening anyway. And if the National Wealth Fund is funding things that can happen without it, then it is a failure of policy, because it's going into the wrong areas. And so I'm hoping that the clarity that's being set out in the kind of things it's going to invest in, National Wealth Fund, green hydrogen, gigafactories, green steel, ports, and one more thing, which I can't remember, but there's already clarity there that those are the kind of things that they want to put money into. GB Energy, meanwhile, the partnership with the Crown Estate is brilliant. It's going to mean that projects can happen quicker, if anything, but they've also been clear that where they want to put money is floating, it's tidal, and it's local community energy working with local councils. And the reason it's those is because they aren't happening at the pace we need. So I'm hoping it won't delay projects that are already in train.
Great. And final word to you, Tim, kind of, is the private sector worried that GB Energy is going to steal its lunch? Going to be public investment?
Not at all. And I think it is worth saying, this is a good thing, right? We've got more public sector capital coming into areas where we absolutely need it to galvanise the private sector. So I think, we should absolutely acknowledge that's good and important. I guess two things I'd say on it. One is, Josh and I have both worked with ministers and had the pleasure of, accompanying them to, large renewables or supply side generation sites wearing, fluorescent jackets and hard hats. And that's really important. The supply side is massively important, but the demand side, less suitable for photo opportunities perhaps, but hugely important. And I think not being distracted onto just the supply side when the demand side is hugely important is going to really matter. Similarly, the supply chains for these things, we talk a lot about wind turbine factories and blade factories, and again, really important, but there's a huge supply chain opportunity in the building space, and we need to think about how we're maximising that. The second thing I'd say is kind of what do we need from GBE and the Wealth Fund to maximise their impact. I think scale matters, as I said before, moving away from kind of lots of small projects to thinking on a larger scale and how we can do that on a fund basis. Secondly, leverage, the crowd in rather than crowd out, and that's a cliche, but I think is really important. Thirdly, simplicity. If you want to fund projects in a lot of sectors in the UK, you've got to talk to kind of 10 different government-funded institutions. There's a risk that becomes 12 with a couple of new ones. How do we kind of narrow that and simplify it? And the last one, I think, is the point Ryan makes, which is pace. There's a real challenge here about it. This needs to be strategic, so you need to kind of have time to do your strategy, but we also need to get on with it. And I think there is enough, pent-up demand that we can move quickly while still thinking with an eye to longer-term strategy.
Just briefly on the supply chain, it does give us the ability to think longer term. And it's why this government having a green industrial strategy approach is so great. I mean, why are most of our turbines built in Europe? That's so frustrating. There was a great report by IPPR recently showing that we have competitive advantage in about a third of the technologies that we need to reach net zero, including turbines and blades for our wind turbines. And so the British Jobs Bonus, which is part of the GB Energy announcements, this is going to be extra money. So if you're bidding into CFDs, auctions to build offshore wind in the UK, you've got to guarantee a certain amount of jobs are being created in the UK. I think that's a really powerful thing. That means that we don't just get the benefits in terms of reduction in emissions, but we get that longer term economic bump as well.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you, Ryan. The one thing I would say, though, is the government doesn't yet have a green industrial strategy. It's definitely got the intention of having one. So the critical thing, I'm sure we'll be discussing next year, will be what does it actually look like in practice, which is exciting indeed. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and thanks so much to our panellists. I think a couple of things that stood out to me, the kind of clarity and consistency and the need to then build on what's already happened, but also the opportunity of a new government to give that clarity over a 5-year period. And I think that came through very clearly, including on the policy side. I think, interestingly, some ideas around how we could use the commercial leadership and the commercial opportunity to play into the residential sector, because so often we just talk about the residential sector, which I think is really impactful. And then finally, just the role of local authorities and local areas. I think that came very strongly in what Ryan was saying, but also as a message kind of from across the panel. So hopefully some useful reflections for us all. Thanks again for coming. There's a whole range of policy exchange events happening over the next couple of days, so please do come join us again. And with that, we'll end. Please thank our panel in the normal way.